Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. Of course, we are here together on stolen land, so I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land and paying my respects to the elders of the Kulin Nation, past, present and emerging. And I'm sure my panellists would like to support me in that acknowledgement. Sovereignty was never ceded, and I feel like as artists and writers and people who care about other people, which I reckon there's a few of us in this audience, given the topic, it is our job to work to educate ourselves on the history of colonisation and the way it continues to impact First Nations folk. Now to our discussion today. It's all about consent and how this topic could potentially make the world a bit safer and kinder. Maybe I'm being optimistic.
Yeah, look, we can try.
And I want to say it might seem like a heavy topic, and it might be a heavy topic at some times. And if you do need to leave, please do what you got to do. Self-care first, and we won't... Closer? Is this better? That's okay. We won't be bothered if you do need to go out, step out and take a moment for yourself. It's all good. And it is kind of a heavy topic, but it's also a topic around hope, and it makes me feel a little bit, as I said, optimistic about the world maybe being a little bit nicer if we can change some of these mistakes, or, I don't know, some of the things that we probably don't do as well as we could as a society in this area. So I'd encourage you to keep that kind of optimism through this conversation, and we'll try and end on a positive note. We won't try, we will. And I will throw to audience questions about 15 minutes from the end. So if you do have a burning question, save it up and we might have time. We also may not. If you have a specific question for anybody here, you can always jump on Twitter. Is everyone on Twitter?
No.
No.
Bad luck, everyone.
Facebook.
There's our friend Google. Google will help you. We will break some of these concepts down as well, but let it be known that my 4-year-old niece knows the word patriarchy and what it means, so we really have no excuses. So I'll give myself a quick intro. I'm Amy Middleton. I'm a journalist and a writer, and I founded Archer magazine, which is that. Oh, I'll hold it up. It's this. It's a twice-yearly print magazine. We have an online branch as well. And it's all about collecting lesser-heard voices on topics around sexuality, gender and identity. So we kind of publish everything the mainstream media doesn't on these topics, which means there's loads of discussion of consent in our publication. And it's an area that I think everyone's still learning in, which makes it really interesting. And it's good to see so many people here. This is awesome. It was rainy and everything.
Yeah.
It's hard to leave when it's rainy. All right, now to our panel. To my immediate left is Deanne Carson. Please make her welcome.
I'm having trouble with mic. Thank you. When I work out the mic, I'll say thank you.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, thanks.
Deanne Carson is CEO of Body Safety Australia, a not-for-profit organisation established in 2015 to promote childhoods free from violence, where children enjoy equitable and respectful relationships. In 2018, she sparked global debate about consent when she dared to talk about creating a culture of consent from infancy on the ABC. Does anyone remember? Maybe we'll talk a bit about that later.
Nappy Gate.
Nappy Gate. Yeah. Hashtag Nappy Gate. The video clocked up over 20 million views in 2 weeks, and the death and rape threats unfortunately jammed Deanne's inbox.
Yeah.
I like the fact that Nappy Gate has now made it into your bio, as though it's actually just like an awesome thing that happened. That's so good. So thank you for being here. Another round of applause. Thank you. Next to Deanne is Anne-lise Ah-fat, a community organiser, mother of 2, facilitator and educator who is passionate about transformative justice. Anne-lise is a co-founder of Undercurrent Community Education Project and also works as a training coordinator in men's family violence, a men's behaviour change practitioner, family violence consultant and trainer. Anne-lise is passionate about accountability, prison abolition and malleefowl, and coordinates Incendium Library and IRL Info Shop. Anne-lise works with persons of diverse cultural and economic backgrounds and believes that social change can only occur collectively. Please make her welcome.
Thank you.
It's really nice.
Thank you. I wish I had sparked global debate, but I have not.
There's still time. There's 55 minutes left in this.
Hashtag Anne-lise Global.
Gate. Anne-lise Gate. And next we have Bexx. Bexx is a Māori Ghanaian woman, currently residing in Melbourne. Her passion for inclusion has seen her curate and develop events with the aim to platform communities that are often forgotten, ranging from conferences, club nights like Box Oceania in Aotearoa.
Hey, you pronounced it right.
Did I?
Yeah, you did.
It went all right. I've been practising. Alterity Collective in Melbourne, to corporate and council spaces like Darebin Feast, Listen Conference and Melbourne Fringe. She ensures as an event producer that spaces are as safe as possible for those attending, prioritising young people, people of colour, people of faith, those with accessibility requirements and those who aren't out as queer. She understands the various ways in which consent plays into these spaces. Currently, she's in the community and youth sector working on Invisible, which centres queer, trans and intersex people of colour, known as QTPOC, and queer international students, and working with Listen to create their conference for early 2020.
Yeah.
Please make Bexx welcome.
Thanks.
All right. I thought I'd start with a question for each of you and then some sort of more broad topics. So Deanne, I might start with you.
Okay.
Are you ready?
I hope so.
Yeah,
I hope I'm ready.
It wasn't supposed to sound that intimidating.
I know.
It's going to be fine. So Deanne, your work revolves around educating kids of all ages, right from nappies, as we heard, and early childhood,
Yep.
on bodies and sexuality and consent. Mm-hmm. So I had a baby last year, so I'm just going to use this as a little bonus tutorial for my own parenting. But can you please run us all through what you advocate for in this area, and I guess what that means for us as either parents or uncles and aunts or guardians or humans in general? Anything about best practice would be great.
That's a really big, broad question, Amy.
You have 5 minutes.
I have 5 minutes. Awesome. Okay. So we work a lot with parents from infancy, and it's when we're working with young children, it's really important to get the parents on board because they're the ones who are actually taking this information and putting it into practice in the home. Major things that we cover are things like bodily autonomy and the child's agency in that, and where the exceptions to bodily autonomy should be as well, and where the children can have agency in that. So this is my body belongs to me, I have a right to say what happens with it, but there are some times when it comes to health, hygiene and safety where my grown-ups might have to make a choice, but my grown-ups do need to be working with me to let me know what's happening and how that's going to unfold, and give me choices in that make me feel safe as well. When they are becoming a little bit older and aware of a separation between themselves and other people, it's really we really focus on the fact that not only does a child have rights, but they have responsibilities as well, and those responsibilities to other people are individual to that person. So what might be okay for your child might love to roughhouse, might not be okay for other children, and just because she really loves it, just because she really loves it doesn't mean that she can jump in and do that with other children because it might not be their jam. Yeah.
It was actually hugs that we had to teach her consent about. She's far too keen on hugging everyone.
Yeah. And hugs are gorgeous, and I think it's really important in this area. So often we have adults, whether they're parents or guardians or teachers or educators, go, but what about affection? Are we going to lose affection? Are we going to lose a space where we're not allowed to touch our children anymore, where we're not allowed to give them comfort, where we're not allowed, we're going to be so caught up in the asking. But affection is still, particularly for young children when it comes to, their development, affection is still really, really important. Just taking that moment to check in and make sure that affection is wanted and reciprocated is something really simple to do. And then the pleasure of receiving affection where you know that it's not coerced or compliant is quite extraordinary. Yeah.
Yeah. She was just knocking other babies over in the sandpit. So that's when you got to call it quit. You're just like, hang on a minute, kid, let's talk about this. Yeah. But as I said in the green room, we managed to teach our 18-month-old how to go about hugging with consent, which was super basic. We were like, look, you go up to the kid and put your arms out, and if the other kid puts their arms out, they want a hug. And if they don't, you don't hug them. So she goes up to other babies and she goes, like, super cute. It was easy. It's easy. It's simple.
Yeah, it is. And what's amazing about that is when you're doing it at such a young age, you're letting them understand the non-verbal cues as well, because so often people aren't stating their consent verbally. They're giving you lots of non-verbal cues, whether that's facial expressions or body language, that they are not consenting. And often when we work with teenagers or young adults, they'll say, but how do I know? But she didn't say no, but, and they get really confused. But if you're working with really young children and having them understand that most interactions around touch are non-verbal, then, they can move into those teen years and adult years with a much greater understanding of that. So well done, you.
Thanks. So that's high praise coming from this panel. We'll talk a bit more about this later. But Anne-lise, I wanted to ask, so you run Undercurrent Victoria, which is a group that delivers training and workshops in the areas of family violence, among other things. I'm keen to hear your views on people who have used violence in the past or do use violence, and accountability. This is something you're really passionate about. It seems to me personally really unhelpful to kind of shun these people from society and consider them different from us somehow, because there's no educational growth involved in that process. You go one step further and you've said that imprisonment for people who choose to use violence isn't a good enough answer just on its own. Can you talk a bit more to this? And what do you think can be done?
I think that's a really huge question.
Are all the answers going to start with that?
I think I'll try and navigate through that question. But firstly, I co-run Undercurrent. So not just me, we have an amazing team of people who do that work in an unpaid capacity. So it's pretty wonderful to share that experience with people. In terms of accountability, yes, it is definitely a passion of mine in terms of all the questions that we probably all have of what do we do, particularly when people in our families, in our communities, in our lives enact family violence, interpersonal violence or sexual assault. And we all probably have these really big questions around what's effective and what's not effective. And one of the things that, we kind of do know in research is that an increase in sentencing in incarceration isn't working. So that isn't decreasing the rates of sexual violence or family violence, intimate partner violence. So we're kind of left with a question of what do we do when that is kind of the state response? So policing as the first responders, and then if people are charged, which is also a really big question around who is profiled enough in the criminal legal system to even end up with a family violence charge, which is not family violence, but usually recklessly causing injury or sexual violence. So there's a whole bunch of questions in there around the criminal legal system and profiling. But I think for me, I'm really interested in working with people on this journey of accountability and what that looks like for somebody. We also know that it's really big work. It often involves people shifting really huge harmful attitudes of beliefs that we've all been recruited into in this world. So when we're thinking about accountability, I do think of it as lifelong. I try and think about, there's like immediate things that we can work with people on, such as like stopping immediate violence and maybe like recognising and acknowledging their use of violence, recognising the consequences of their use of violence, and, hopefully getting to making reparations. And then the bigger work of like changing harmful attitudes and beliefs and becoming a healthy member of their communities. And so, for me, when I think about those things, I'm like, what do we need to do as communities to walk alongside someone who has used violence? And I'm always thinking about when I think about that, I think about the work I need to do in myself, like my daily practices of accountability, my daily moves towards non-violence, the ways in which I parent non-violently, the ways in which I can have friendships, that are respectful, how I can do better at having lovers and partners. And I think, maybe I want to speak to like self-reflexivity. I think oftentimes we sort of talk about what this other person can do. And I can, go on about the work I do in men's behaviour change or the work I do with, people who use violence in the queer community. But I think maybe there's also this like big picture thing there that I'm doing a lot of work myself to be able to be engaged in that work. I'm definitely have been recruited into misogyny and patriarchy, sexism, into white supremacy by being birthed into this world of those oppressions. And so, what are the things individually we can do to create a culture and a context where we're changing the harmful attitudes and beliefs, like community-wide, so that people are stepping into communities where we're talking about sexual respect and respect in general. And even, I'm interested in talking about, when we talk in a little bit about the language of even use of consent and how that's very much tied to crime and the criminal legal system, and thinking about how, as communities we can create communities that are invested in respect and accountability as individuals, instead of like making it this other thing as if it's a monster over there. And the more we like totalise people in that way, I found the less useful it is to work with somebody towards like non-violence and behaviour change.
Hell yeah. Might have been a broad question, but gee, you really answered it. Yeah, it's like you had that one in your back pocket.
No, I'm really unprepared. Like last night I ran group and I worked a 13-hour day yesterday, and I was like texting one of my best friends and I was like, oh my God, I've got this panel tomorrow. I'm completely unprepared and I've got to work all day and then the panel. And I was not prepared. I was just like, what am I going to say? I don't know.
Turns out it doesn't matter. Great work. So thank you so much for sharing that.
When this is podcasted, delete all you need to.
Bexx.
Hey.
Hi. Your work centres around space and place.
Yeah.
So it's quite a different area, but you definitely encourage venues and festivals and events and I guess places like this to prioritise safety and respect for individuals, especially those from marginalised backgrounds. So can you talk a bit about how consent and autonomy shifts when we're talking about people from marginalised backgrounds, whether they're people who identify as queer or they're not out as queer, or queer people of colour, people from diverse backgrounds, and I guess why this needs to be a conversation of its own alongside this conversation?
I almost ate that.
Knock yourself out.
Close is good, though.
So I feel like I'm forever learning things because I'm only like little snippets from all those communities that you just mentioned, and there's so many more as well. So I can only kind of draw from my own personal experience, but like also my main thing is to try and facilitate other people who are from those lived experiences and try and pay them to give me some help with that as well. But we, especially in the collectives that I worked with as well, we tried to prioritise the people that are coming into that space because we couldn't do these events all the time. We knew that a lot of our friends were making big efforts to come through, lying to parents about where they're going, cancelling work, putting down a fake name, getting someone else to buy a ticket, like all those things are things that not necessarily myself, but a lot of my friends have gone through. And so learning things about consent was popping up when we started collaborating with organisations who thought that they had autonomy of everyone that came in that space. And that meant like taking photos, getting the information, getting one photo of someone that was just like, oh yeah, they look amazing, they've got like their ass out, like we're going to use that in promos for 5 years, like it's going to be great. And so the consent topic kind of came through, and we started doing these events because we essentially did the exact opposite of what we wanted to do, which was bringing people into an unsafe space. And a lot of people that do events tend to not think of that as well, or if they do, they have to compromise finances, because there's organisations that don't want to put in for money that they don't have 100% access to everything that's happening on site. So in terms of consent and like trying to curate those spaces, it got less and less. Less because of like the venues being like, oh yeah, we've got our own photographer and we've got our own person. We're like, no. And we're like, okay, well, we're just going to cancel this. To the point where venues kind of didn't want to work with us because they're like, oh, well, you're the troublemakers. And I'm like, but if you think we're a troublemaker, then you know there's some trouble in your place already. So like, you know, you just done your own jobs. So when even though I keep on saying the word consent, thinking of those things, and we start to do events and like making those spaces, it was really good to actually like listen to people whilst they were there as well. So I'd always like, everyone else that like did events, I'd always be super sober, and I'd be like, you know, chatting to everyone. I'd be like, how are you finding this? I'm like, oh, the security guard was a bit of a dick. Like they tried to make sure that like my ID matched me, and I'm like, and then tried to like put the ID and like squish it against my face to make sure. And I was just like, well, first of all, they broke your boundaries, and second of all, who was it? So I can like stare at them. I can't say anything because like I'm working at the moment, but like I'll stare at them and I'll try and do something. But it's those kind of things that it would only take for me to happen like once before all of a sudden I've got like a whole document where you have to check through so many things before I'm like, all right, now I'm ready to do a party. I haven't done a party in 2 years because of that. So it's just kind of like having to facilitate that with your own funds, because of course people aren't going to pay for that. But I'm absolutely no way, shape or form going to be inviting my friends into a space where they think it's going to be safe because I'm curating it, and not giving them like the actual proof and like the very heartfelt like, please come here. I've even made sure that there's like white cups so you can see it, because I know you don't wear your glasses because you want to show your amazing eyebrows. Like, please come through. Like, I've done this for you. So it's, yeah, the consent definitely like seems to be a bit of a problem with people when it comes to them like giving away a little bit of power. And I say a little bit because it is small. Don't take photos. Like, you don't have to like grill people about their real names on their thing. They look over 30. Like, come on. Like, so there's like, yeah, it's a bit of a problem, but I just have to come to the conclusion that a lot of these venues and organisations and people that want to do parties will eventually come to their own realisation when they're like, oh, maybe we should do it this way because, you know, everyone else is doing it, and then they'll come back.
It is all trend-based, isn't it, unfortunately?
It is. It really is. So, you know, hopefully they have money by then. So they can actually pay all these people. They've been doing the work for free half the time. So, yeah.
This speaks a bit to what each of you have said. This is a question for all three of you, whoever wants to weigh in. I reckon this topic of consent can be really challenging for people because facing up to new learnings also means facing up to some mistakes that you may have made in the past or things that make you cringe. And I think that can be immobilising for people. So we've all got probably something in our past that's either we've done or has been done to us that we might see now as coercion or harassment or assault or violence. What can we do about these kind of past shadows? And can you say anything that might help people move through them and continue to learn and grow with the knowledge of that stuff that might be a bit uncomfortable?
I feel like that's kind of the process of accountability from what you were saying before. I don't know if there is like a step-by-step guide. I think people are just doing it, and if it doesn't work, they're like, let's not do that again. I don't know.
But sometimes people get it very quickly. A common scenario that I had just yesterday is I run professional development for teachers, and we talk about consent for photo taking, which it just made me think about that when you were talking about venues and photos. And they say, yeah, we're all good, we're all sorted because the parents have consented to having the children's photos taken. And I'm like, but have you asked the children about having their photos taken? Because, and as I'm sure that you would as well, we get called into schools when there's been some scandal or some crisis, and they want us to tell the teenagers that they've been very, very naughty children for sharing nudes. Yeah. And I'm like, but when was the last time that anyone ever asked those young people for consent to have their photo taken? And do their parents still have the ultrasound photos on Facebook open to the public? And one of the teachers said to me, I've got over 3,000 photos of my friend's baby who's 6 months old. And I said, well, have a guess at how many photos do you think that baby's had taken of them? Oh, probably in the vicinity of 1 million. 6 months old, yeah? And of course that baby is not able to give informed consent for that. But all of the teachers in that room, and each time that we have this conversation, they had that realisation of, you know what, you're right. If we're expecting better from the young people, we really have to examine our practices. And there isn't... So I think that we need to go, yes, sometimes those shadows can take a long time. They are growth, and it's an ongoing... a lifelong ongoing journey, and other times it's instantaneous. We just actually have to have that conversation.
And did that person rethink their...
Totally. The
snappy?
The whole school has gone back to rewrite policies and incorporate conversations with the children and young people, and have new conversations with the parents and guardians, and yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Anne-lise, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think for me it's like really useful to understand like the context of like discomfort or uncomfortability when like you've leaned into, doing something that's harmed somebody. But I don't think it's useful to have that context be used as the excuse to not then, make moves into changing the harmful behaviour. But in terms of like working alongside people towards accountability, I think that stuff around shame and the stuff around understanding that there's different reactions to when somebody, I guess, first maybe realises or is told or is like brought into the context where they're made aware of their use of violence, that there is different reactions to that might look, like defensiveness or anger or that person positioning themselves as the victim, and or being, really uncomfortable. And I think that is often sometimes really, really difficult, and I would never put it in a position that everybody needs to work in that space. I think for some people, like I am somebody that can kind of understand this context and I feel okay in that, but I think oftentimes we kind of demand that everybody be okay with like being in that, and that is really difficult. Like somebody is maybe looking as if they are the victim in their reaction. And so I think it's important to understand that, and probably, I've also, when I think about doing stuff that I'm ashamed of, I'm like, what do? I get defensive, make something up, blame the person closest to me. Like, I didn't do it. I was like, but that person. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is exactly what people do who, have used violence and come to that realisation. So that as a context is important to understand, but yeah, how do we work with that? So that we're able to support that person to move through that, to be like, that's maybe part of your journey, but where to now, and how do we work with you to then move towards, respectful relationships or addressing the harm that's been caused.
So are you talking about the complexity of teasing out who is a victim?
No, more so that when you first, that question of the discomfort.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Teasing out. Oh, so you're saying not everybody has to work in that space at all times.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so fair. And finding those boundaries around this stuff, I think, is really important too. I think in recent years we've been sort of overwhelmed by this new influx of knowledge in this area, and it's made a lot of us feel like we need to be in it at all times. Can any of you talk to how you've put personal boundaries on your work to look after yourselves, and how that might help some other people as well?
Why did everyone look at me?
Oh, no.
So let's talk about Nappygate for a second.
Yay!
So when that happened,
Can you tell the story for those who don't know?
for those of you who don't know, I did an interview with the ABC. It was like midday news. Nobody watches that except my mum, right? She rang me to tell me how great I was, but maybe my hair was a bit pink. Did you want to tone it down? Anyway.
I don't know if you noticed, but your hair was a bit pink.
It was a bit pink, yeah. and it was on. It was actually, and this is one of the things that got me most angry, because it was actually off the back of the Four Corners exploration of Saxon Mullen's rape case. I don't know if you remember that, but horrific rape that occurred to a young woman in Sydney, and they were speaking to me about how we change culture and how we have better understandings of consent. And I was talking about how we teach consent in high schools, and how we teach it in primary schools, and how we teach it in early childhood, and how we work with parents when their children are infants. And I made the mistake of using nappy and consent in the same sentence. And somebody got a hold of the video and sent it to some really right-wing men's rights activists, and they went, "Oh, crazy pink-haired lesbian wants us to ask for consent for nappy changes." Yeah, which is not exactly what I said, but that's okay. And it was used. It was picked up and used. And actually, in speaking with the police at a later date, they went, yes, some of the people who were instigating this conversation are known sex offenders. So there was definitely an agenda in silencing me in that space. I did the interview on a Thursday. Mother's Day was on that Sunday. And I kind of naively went, oh, I understand the news cycle. I've been through this before. I've been through the trolling before. I'm really grateful that this happened on Thursday, because the media cycle will die on Friday. By Monday, somebody else is going to be the little black duck sitting on social media. No, that didn't happen. By Sunday, I have 2 teenagers, and by Sunday, which was Mother's Day, I could not leave the house. I didn't get out of bed all day, and my teenagers brought me breakfast in bed. Fortunately, the trolls didn't know. Can I swear? Yeah. Fortunately, the trolls didn't know I had children, because I was too ugly to fuck, was the general consensus. And yet they wanted to rape me, not sure.
It's always confusing,
I know,
isn't it?
So confused. And I did need to put in some pretty strong boundaries at that point, because I wasn't okay, my kids weren't okay, my partner wasn't okay. Too ugly to fuck, have a partner. And all of the educators, the young people that I work with weren't okay either, and they were all going into schools the following week not knowing what was going to happen, what kind of reception they were going to have from the schools. And at that point, my social media went down. I came off LinkedIn, I came off Twitter, I came off all of those spaces, and I actually had to be in Wodonga for work. I took my daughter with me because I didn't want to leave her home alone, because I was worried about what might happen to her. And from there, so this is a long, convoluted way of saying, from there have been some really clear boundary settings, not just for myself, but for the team that I work with, and for my children as well. My children aren't linked on my social media. I don't get notifications on my phone about anything. No notification. Oh, text messages, that's it. No notifications, and really clear boundaries in place for the team as well. But if I've got time, I want to say another thing that's not related to that, that we need to be really careful about is vicarious trauma, because I've got 6 educators who I work with. They're all in their 20s, and our team gets on average 4 disclosures of childhood sexual abuse a week. Yeah. So working in schools, primary schools mostly, primary schools and early learning centres. So this is a constant conversation we have around boundaries, around self-care, around community care. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing those 2 stories. And definitely relevant in terms of vicarious trauma. Bexx or Anne-lise, do either of you want to add to that?
Yeah.
I mean, the things that I've had around consent haven't been that heavy, or maybe I've just seen it as a red flag and like kind of worked with people that have like an academic background to be able to deal with those. I guess I could say there's like a personal boundary, because knowing like a lot of friends that have those sort of lived experiences, and working with the youth sector as well, and I'm sure you probably both feel this too, like if you hear something that's happening and you know you can fix it, but there's so many red tapes that you can't go through. So like putting up a personal boundary is really good when you're like in those kind of areas as well. That's really shit, sorry.
No, how do you do it? What works for you, Bexx?
Yes. Yeah, no, I'm still like mulling over those, but like in terms of consent, like the personal boundaries, and like especially for myself, the first time I came across like learning about other people's boundaries is when we did our first event, and we had a photographer, and we were like, made sure that no one took photos of anyone, but like one photo slipped in, and it was from someone that wasn't out, and we got ourselves torn apart. And it was fair. Luckily enough, they responded within 24 hours, and we ripped it off within 25 hours. So that works. So when you were talking about accountability and like learning from that, I found that like everyone else doesn't really take that on board, and they start doing that defensive thing you were talking about, which is like, it wasn't me. They're in the background. It's not my fault. Like, F you. And I'm just like, just take it down. Just take it down. You still got 200. It's all good. But that was like something that we all had to learn as well, because that was a fuck up on our point. And I think in terms of accountability, like hearing other people's stories, especially if it's nothing to do with yours as well, is actually really good, and owning up to the fact that you're fucked up. I'm swearing too.
Open the floodgates.
Yeah. I think that's something for everyone to be taking on board, like on a regular basis, and as much as possible as well.
I think I have like really complicated relationship with the idea of self-care. And vicarious trauma as well. Like, I think it's not our clients or young people that we work with that like cause us to have like a sadness or a pain. It's like usually the context or the structural context of that work that causes us to like be working not within our ethics, which means that oftentimes it is a hardness to be in the work. So I personally am not like impacted by the many people that share their experiences of violence with me. I have lots of like amazing like collective care things in my life, and I'm really passionate about building networks of solidarity with people where we have those structures where we're able to support each other in the work, so that it doesn't become this like individualised thing as though that sharing of the story has somehow done something to me, which I think then positions our clients or people we work with in kind of a strange way, I guess. So I'm really, if you're interested in that sort of like analysis, like Vicky Reynolds speaks really deeply about that, how we can like reconceptualise some of our really individualistic understandings of self-care and move towards collective care, and how we can better support each other in this work rather than seeing the many stories or experiences that we that come into our lives in this work as a burden, I guess.
And we talk about, instead of collective care, we talk about community care.
Yeah.
And I'm a single mum and raised my kids solo and did this work and studied and did all of those things. And I very much agree with you that the burden of individualised care when you're carrying so many different responsibilities is onerous of itself, and it needs to be community-based. Yeah.
Totally, like this idea that like, don't get me wrong, getting a massage is like super awesome, but the idea of like getting a massage is somehow going to make you feel better in this work is like so false. Like, yes, I get massages, I go get my nails done, fuck yeah, it makes me feel really good, but like it's not like doing anything to address like structural violence in any way. And like that's why I'm doing this work, to like try and address structural violence.
And I think if somebody had told me when my children were little, go and get a massage, I would have punched them in the face. Not that I advocate violence, but where is the time, where is the money, where is the capacity to do those things that people, perceive? It's a very middle-class white take on things that, you can jump into, a bubble bath or a weekend away or a massage,
All great things, but...
Yeah.
Really
We talk about giving up, doing yard duty for your teacher friends so that they can go for a walk in the park. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. That's nice. I want to ask something just for a bit of 101. So, as I've said, I guess this information is quite new to a lot of us, and I'm interested to know if topics around consent particularly are still contested. There have been shifts in the learnings and the teachings over the last few years. Does anyone want to talk to those? What's changed for you during your work in this area and why those things have shifted? Yeah, Anne-lise, you're nodding. Yeah, so keen.
I think the ideas of consent have shifted like so drastically over the years that I've been like involved in this sort of like this sort of stuff in my communities and my friendship groups. Like I remember when I was like maybe I think like 17, 18 and first coming into like hardcore punk anarchist scene. And like we were all about like consent is sexy, and just like that was like, we made patches, we were just like, yeah, that's like, and then we were like, oh no, like the analysis is so wrong because like structurally like some people can't like say yes because of like all the different power dynamics going on. So, and consent sometimes is not sexy. It's just like really boring and like kind of annoying sometimes in terms of like the conversation, and it might not be sexy to people. So like then we were like, oh, we've got to make new patches. What do we do? Like, how do we talk about this? And I really think the analysis of consent has really changed. And then there's like ideas around like that the premise of consent itself is really linked to crime and the criminal legal system and puts the onus on survivors to prove their innocence. And that's where the history of the ideas around consent comes from. That's still how the courts, criminal legal system run in terms of consent. So we have more started using the language around like how do we build sexual respect in our relationships, how do we move and strive towards sexual respect, and what does sexual respect look like with each other and sexual boundaries, so that we can sort of have other languages, I guess. We know language is really powerful. And I think sometimes when we lean into just that word consent, it can become really reductive, where we then do go into this thing of like no means no, yes means yes. And it's like, well, that's actually really complicated because we know that power is complicated. And sometimes yes doesn't mean yes, and sometimes no doesn't mean no. So how do we actually develop sexual respect where we can, as Deanne said, like be able to like have languages around non-verbal communication, verbal communication, and create cultures of respect, so that, the onus isn't always on like survivors of violence to be having to like express something in like particular ways that are heard.
So what would your patch say now?
No more patches. I've truly moved away. I've moved away from the patches.
From bumper sticker advocacy.
I'm in a punk band, but no more patches. No more patches.
We're going to throw to Q&A shortly, but do either of you two want to add anything about that or something else?
I just want to add, when we because we don't really talk a lot about sex when we're working with the very young ones, but we do help them unpack what compliance looks like, and we do help them unpack what coercion looks like and what pressure looks like. And having worked with these young people for a number of years now, and then moving, into high school with them and starting to introduce, those ideas around sex, they have that much more nuanced understanding of power imbalances and about why sometimes people might be compliant, or why sometimes people, what coercive interactions look like, and they feel much more empowered in that space, because we are moving away from that black and white, yes or no, just say yes or no.
Yeah.
So it's about them understanding power relations and the pressure
And
that
all
can
of the
arise.
different power dynamics. Like, I think we're totally also moving away from that conversation just being about gender as well.
Big time.
Yeah.
Definitely. If I can just say something as well. Definitely, because I think we can't move towards like conversations around respect, like sexually or, in other contexts in our life, without talking about like settler colonisation and consent, in terms of like living in a violent, stolen country where there's unconsensually land was taken and still has not been given back. And I think when we are growing up and live in this, like, this sets the scene for like the ways that we also do intimate partner relationships. So if, when I'm thinking about how do I like develop, sexual respect in my life and in my, communities, I'm like, how does the state move towards accountability in terms of colonisation?
I mean, I don't really. That's all really good stuff for like in terms of like intimacy and consent, but I've always thought of consent in terms of like going into spaces. So that's like work, venues, like parties, whatever else. And I think it's really good to think of that the notion of consent is given up when you enter into those spaces is actually really fucked. And people still have like autonomy to decide on what they do within those spaces too. So that's including in your office as well. Just because you're going in there doesn't mean you've given up consent, so they can like go through your emails and do everything else as well. It also means when you're visiting a lover, like you're not giving up consent because you're going to their house. Like you can still consent to everything as well. But like thinking more broadly around those like ideas too, like all about spaces, but also moot point because we're on stolen land. There was no consent, so yeah.
I did promise we'd finish on a positive note.
Oh, sorry.
No, I'm going to facilitate that.
Okay.
What has been a highlight or a really beautiful moment in your work in this area? If the three of you could reflect on something that just inspires you to keep going or suggests that there's been some change. Can anyone think of one?
Yeah. I met a really, really, really good friend of mine on the other end of my first ever event because when we had photos taken, we actually sat down for a whole weekend and tried to find everyone on Facebook and match the faces. And we're like, we've got this photo of you. Do you want it? Can we put it up? If we don't want to put it up, you can have it. We'll destroy it. Like, it's all good. And there was this one photo of like these two people dancing, and I was like, oh, let's find this person. So I messaged them. I didn't hear anything back for 2 days. And then all of a sudden I got this message back, and they're like, thank you so much. That was like one of my first queer events, and like I'm not out, and like thank you so much for asking me. I'm going to keep that photo. Like I don't have any photos of any of my friends, and we've been best friends now for 5 years. So and we've done events together now. So
yeah. Thank you for sharing, Bex.
Yeah, I really like that story.
I think something that has given me hope is, well, maybe I'll talk about my children, as you two did. But this morning, actually, my oldest was talking about a situation where some of his friends had experienced coercion whilst like at a party, and he talked about how he was talking to the people that had that were coercive. And so I was asking him, I was like, oh, like, how are you going about having that conversation? And he was like, well, first I'm going to like message them all to see if they want to talk and meet up. And I was like, whoa, so you're not just going to do it like all online? And he was like, no, I feel like we need to maybe have that conversation face to face. And, I'm just going to try, he's like in this, I'm just going to try to talk to them. And I was like, oh my God, I'm so fucking proud of you. Like, so many people would just like ignore this and just be like, that's like not me to have that conversation. Someone else will do it, which we know is what like, creates the community in which like enables violence to occur. And I just think, when I think about him, I'm like, oh, like I did something okay, like I had enough conversations with him that he feels like he can have those with other people and that he feels okay to do that. I have hope in that.
Oh, that's awesome. Thanks, Anne-lise.
I was spending all of that time thinking because it's every day. It's absolutely every day. Every day we walk into the schoolyard and, a 6-year-old will run up to us and say, oh, can I give you a hug? Yes, so much. And I was thinking about Nappygate and the... I was thinking about I've got a very busy head. And I was thinking about all of the messages that I had, but there was one particular message from a much older man who said, be brave, be strong. I didn't get it. I didn't get it until you explained it. And now, and none of my mates get it, and I'm going to go and have that conversation with them. But the one that I want to tell you, that I settled on at the end, sorry, don't apologise. The one I want to tell you is that we worked with a 4-year-old kindergarten, and there's always a question about when you're doing primary prevention work, does it actually work? Does primary prevention work actually work? We worked with a 4-year-old kindergarten, and 8 months later I had a phone call from a mum who said that her child was now in primary school and that her child was a fairly quiet, compliant, good girl, and that one of the other children had tried to pull down her underpants at school. And she immediately assumed the position and said, "Stop! I don't like it." And when told the principal, and that was nearly 9 months after we'd done the program, just 2 sessions with 4-year-olds. Yeah.
Oh, so good. Thanks for sharing those stories. If anybody has a question, you can raise your hand now, and the ushers will take a look around. And while we're waiting for that to happen, do you 3 want to give a plug for anyone that wants any more info? Where are the best resources to go? Anywhere that you'd send people for further reading?
If you know any young cutie park people, they can come through to Invisible. We're having a launch this Friday. Heaps of free stuff, but also resource. So that resource has been sent out nationally to a lot of youth drop-in centres and organisations that work with young LGBTQI kids. So if you're wanting some resources, we've got them for free. We're more than happy to send them out to you as well.
And they're beautiful.
Oh, you saw?
I did. I was so impressed.
They are really beautiful.
They smell beautiful as well.
They do. Magazines have that effect,
yeah.
And just quickly, you two, before we go to audience.
There's a bunch of stuff on the Undercurrent Vic website. I also do a podcast radio show on transformative justice, trying to make resources accessible in terms of not making absolutely everything in a novel format. Listen to my radio show.
What's it called, Anne-lise?
Boringly, it's called Transformative Justice Podcast. But on the Undercurrent Vic website. Or there's just a whole bunch of stuff on transformative justice if you Google.
Yeah. Our website, bodysafetyaustralia.com.au, great resources, good programs for early childhood and primary. But I actually want to plug something that's nothing to do with me. Corey Silverberg's books. Does anyone know Corey Silverberg's books? If you're a parent, who's a parent?
Ooh.
Yeah. What Makes a Baby and Sex is a Funny Word. Best books ever.
Yeah, I do, yeah. Thanks you 3.
Random plug.
A series of random plugs. Do we have someone? Yep.
Hi. Oh. Yeah, no, it's working. I just got freaked out by the sound of my voice. I was just wondering, you've talked, I think, about teaching consent and gaining consent, but I'm wondering what happens or what steps get taken when consent is broken. Like, what strategies are in place for that when you're teaching children or when you're interacting with, or with any age, really?
Do you want to that when consent is broken in the classroom while we're there, or when they let us know that consent has been broken?
I guess I was thinking more in terms of, like, I haven't given consent for something and it's happened anyway.
Yeah.
General question.
So that was, I haven't given consent for something and it's happened anyway. So lived experience from a young person? From anyone.
Yeah. So we have legal responsibilities in Victoria. So if a child discloses to us that someone has harmed them, we are duty bound to report that. So I think that's one thing, but most of our work is prevention work. So we will be constantly noticing, I can see, in the classroom, we'll be noticing, I can see that you're sitting really closely to your friend, but she's kind of leaning away from you. Do you just want to check in with her to make sure that she's actually consenting to that touch? So I'm not sure if that answers your question though.
In undercurrent workshops, but we don't do like a primary school or earlier age than that context. So ours start from year 7 till, older people. And we, in every single workshop, we will always do a part of that, which is called support. In every workshop, that's like the core of our work, and we'll never do a workshop without that component. And we also do workshops that then focus on like accountability and what that looks like. And that's, from year 7 till the end of life, I guess. Yeah. But our focus will be on how to support someone who's experienced harm every time.
Can you give a little rundown of it for anybody that might be looking for that info now? Is there somewhere they can go to access it?
Yeah, we do have like a pretty easy to read and access document on the Undercurrent website around like different ways to like empathetically respond and validate, and how you might be in that conversation, like what listening looks like, and different things of like being in dialogue with somebody who's experienced harm. Yeah.
What's the document called?
I think it's called, I wrote this, so I should know what the title is.
Perhaps you could
I think it's
Google-
called like how to respond to someone who shares their experience of violence with you, is what it's called.
It's catchy. If you go on the Undercurrent website, it's hosted there though,
It's
yeah?
there,
Okay,
yeah.
cool.
You can also email me, Anne-lise Ah-fat @undercurrentvic.com. I can send you a whole bunch of things.
So you're all working in lots of different types of consent. I'd love to know, are you particularly surprised or delighted to see conversations about consent moving in a particular direction? Do you see it going in future directions? Are there particular types of consent where you're like, great that that's being talked about? Or do you have a wish list, particular types of consent or conversations about consent that you just wish would get talked about more?
Great question.
Consent in the workspace is, for people that have a workspace, but I think consent, when you were saying before, is kind of like given away because of job security. So a lot of people are just like, I'll do anything just to keep my job, and they end up letting their bosses just do the most fucked up shit. So I think consent to the higher ups and seniors would be amazing, but good luck. They don't like to admit defeat, so.
There's that positive note we wanted to finish on.
I'm so sorry. No, everyone can make a change.
But that is interesting in terms of can everybody make a change when they're indoctrinated into a hierarchy, when they are the manager?
Yeah.
And the role of the manager is power over. So I'm maybe it's hierarchy that we need to get rid of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When protective behaviours first started in Australia, it was very much focused on stranger danger, which makes up about 5 to 10% of childhood sexual abuse cases. So we were ignoring the 90% and just focusing on the people that we could demonise Yeah, it's, the monsters, the strangers. We're now starting to focus on, then there came the Royal Commission and we were allowed to demonise priests, finally. No. And now we've got to focus on families and extended families. But I'm looking for conversations about adolescents who use sexual violence, because we know that the vast majority of that can be prevented. So, unlike, some of the people implicated in the Royal Commission, working with teenagers and adolescents, and if we talk about sexual abuse of children under the age of 6, for girls under the age of 6, nearly half of that abuse is perpetrated by teenagers, usually of around 14 years old. And we know that they don't go on to become adult offenders, so actually doing that work in a younger stage is really strong preventative work, and I'd like to see the conversation go there. I'd like us to be brave enough to have that conversation. Yeah.
Anne-lise?
I think it's interesting because I kind of sit in the primary prevention end and then also the intervention response end. And I know this isn't ending on a hope, but I do think that actually the conversations are quite similar that Undercurrent are having with young men and that I'm having in men's behaviour change groups. So I think, unfortunately, culturally, not that much has shifted. It might kind of look like it has because we have a billboard that says, respect women. But in terms of what the context of how culturally we're living, I'm not sure how much has really shifted. But I am excited about having the conversation. And
You can do it.
yeah,
Don't force it now.
Yeah, I'm excited in work that many communities are doing actually. So I'm less excited about state responses, and I'm really excited about the work that First Nations people are doing across the world around state violence as well as community violence. I'm interested in the work that lots of QTPOC people are doing in terms of navigating violence in their communities, and mainly people who cannot use the state are developing really awesome responses and having really cool conversations around how to build communities of non-violence. So yeah, I'm excited about that, but I think culturally culturally in terms of the culture of violence needs to, there's a long way to go. And I think part of that is what I kind of said before around living in the context of capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, ableism, homophobia, transphobia. We're still living in that context. So it's not surprising that not many things have shifted.
I think
Sorry.
that's a nice... No, it's good. I've got this. I think that's a really nice reminder that if we want more info on this and how to be better and make a warmer, safer, kinder world, maybe looking to the traditional resources that we would normally turn to for information isn't the only approach. We should look to our communities, have lots of discussions with friends and acquaintances, and maybe particularly look at intersecting communities, because that's where change often starts, but it's a lot less loud.
Yeah.
And on that note, I'd like to thank the Wheeler Centre for allowing us to have this conversation in this space, because it's pretty special, and especially to thank our 3 panellists, Bexx and Anne-lise and Deanne. Can you please join me in thanking them?
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.